Greetings, folks.
Greetings to you.
And to you folks out there on the CD program, of course, as always. I've been reading in the book of Ezekiel this week. And I guess my sermon would be called more of a Bible study than an actual sermon. And I learned some things. Some things that I'd put together that I hadn't really thought about. You know, but the book of Ezekiel is by no means an easy book to understand. And I don't profess by any means to clearly understand it all. I really don't. The book of Ezekiel is a book of prophecy. And as we all know, a whole lot of prophesied prophecy in the Bible is yet to come to pass. And we, and can by no means go through the entire book of Ezekiel today. But I would like to address at least the beginning of the book in the time allotted, and maybe in the future we can address some more of it. So to begin with, I would like to briefly address the first three chapters. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, "Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Shebar," I guess that's how that's pronounced, or Shebar, "that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." So Ezekiel saw some visions here that came from God. Now most commentaries seem to indicate that this was not the 30th year of captivity, rather that this was the age of Ezekiel, since this was the age when most servants of God became ministers or prophets. For in verse 2 it says it was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. Of course, that's neither here nor there pertaining to what Ezekiel had to say. But as you go through the first chapter of Ezekiel, he describes what seems to be maybe a portable throne of God. I don't really know. And there are people that doesn't believe in God and who doesn't believe in the spiritual world, who claim this was some sort of spaceship, with aliens from another planet. However, as true Christians, we should have no doubt that it was a direct vision from God. Now, Satan would like for us to believe otherwise, and he uses certain people through his deception to try to convince us otherwise. And then we come to chapter 2, we see God giving Ezekiel a commission, much like the commission Jesus gave his disciples and his ministers in the end time, which is to proclaim a witness and a warning to God's people. Well, not only to God's people, but the world in the end time. But he tells Ezekiel, he says, "Stand on your feet, and I will speak to you." So in verse 3 of chapter 2, the Lord tells Ezekiel that he's going to send him to the house or the children of Israel, which is a rebellious nation, he says, which has rebelled against him even unto this very day. And by the way, that would be February the 29th, 2020. He also tells Ezekiel they are a stiff-necked and rebellious people. Before it's all over, they will know that there's been a prophet among them. God tells him to speak his words unto them, whether they will listen or whether they won't listen. And that's still our job today, folks. As God's ministers, we don't strive to offend anyone, but we have to tell the truth, even if it does. And the truth does offend a lot of people. Then he tells, the book tells us here that God, or Ezekiel tells us, God gave him a book. It was written within and without. And it tells us the words that were written were lamentations, mournings, and woes. That, folks, is not good news. What was written there was not good news. Then in verse 3, and I'll paraphrase some of this also, the Lord gave Ezekiel the words he wanted him to speak. And Ezekiel, it says, digested those words, or he digested the words of the book. Again in verse 4, we see he was sent to the house of Israel, not to a people of strange speech. The Lord said, if I were to send you to a people of strange speech, they would listen and change, but not the house of Israel, for they are imprudent and hard-hearted. Imprudent and hard-hearted. Then we come to verse 17 in Ezekiel chapter 3. Here we see God giving a dire warning to the ministry. He says, Son of man, I have made you a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore, hear the word at my mouth, and give them warning from me. So what God is going to tell Ezekiel, and when you read the whole book, you will see it was a warning to the house of Israel from God. When I say unto the wicked, you shall surely die, and you don't give them any warning to turn them from their wicked ways, they shall die in their iniquities, but their blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the wicked, and they still don't turn from their wicked ways, they will still die in their iniquities, but you will deliver your soul. Then he speaks of the righteous man. He says, the righteous man who turns from his righteous ways and commits iniquities, he says, you must warn him also. For the righteousness he has done will be forgotten, and he too shall die in his iniquities. If you don't warn him, his blood also will be upon you. However, if you warn him and he returns to his righteous ways, he will live, and your soul also shall be delivered. So therefore, we in the ministry, we have an obligation to preach the truth to whomever, and in doing so, we will deliver not only, hopefully, their souls, but our own souls as well. So again, we don't mean to alienate or offend anyone, but what God, by what God has commissioned us to do, yet we have to preach the truth of God to the best of our understanding and abilities. Then we come to chapter 4, which is really where I want to start. Ezekiel's prophecies, like the writings of Paul, can sometimes be a puzzling piece of work. And the implication of a great number of theologians is that any prophecy must have a historical setting. And the words the prophet speaks out of that historical setting is to the people in that historical setting. That's the opinion of a lot of theologians. However, there are certain problems which exist with that when it comes to the book of Ezekiel. So, there's problems when it comes to the book of Ezekiel to that kind of a notion. The notion that Ezekiel's message was only to those people who were in exile with him. So here Ezekiel was, along with some other Jewish captives, by what he called the river Shibar, which means to join together. That's what the word means. Historians say that Shibar was most likely not a river at all, but the famous royal canal of Nebuchadnezzar that connected or joined the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And this is where Ezekiel saw several of his remarkable visions. It was a large Jewish colony who were taken there to Babylon when the city of Jerusalem fell. So here he was, along with a number of the elders. And if the historians are right, he was probably about 30 years old. He was a young priest. And And this may have been one of the first things he did as a priest. We really don't know. And he had this famous vision of a wheel within a wheel. And God lifted him up and gave him all these visions and prophecies. Then back in chapter 3, verse 15, he says he came to them of the captivity of Tel Aviv that dwelt by the river of Shabar, and dwelled among them, and remained there among them astonished 7 days. So it's easy for some to think that, that this was the only people he prophesied to. For he did prophesy to those people. I mean, he was their captivity among them, and so were they. But we run into a major problem here in Ezekiel if you try to deal with only the historical setting. For here he is sitting among people who are in captivity, and his message is that unless you repent and change your evil ways, you will go into captivity. Now, why would you warn a people already in captivity of an impending captivity? What he spoke, what he prophesied, was too late for those people. They were already in captivity. The rest of their lives were already determined. They would die in captivity. The Babylonians had overthrown them and marched them to Babylon and settled them in a colony by this great Babylonian seaport. Then comes this young priest telling these people they are going to go into captivity because they are a rebellious and stiff-necked people. Well, they were already there. Now, before we go further, we must understand there are two different groups of people we're dealing with in this set of prophecies. They are the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And any of you who have done any in-depth study of the Bible and of history know that the house of Israel and the house of Judah will exist at the end time. We know that they are still around. And they exist as two separate peoples, or have two separate identities. And as you read through the book of Ezekiel, you will see that he prophesies that these two separate entities will again be joined together in the end time and become one. That after several thousand years, the house of Israel and the house of Judah will again be joined and become one people or one nation. This separation first occurred shortly after the death of Solomon, when his son Rehoboam took over the throne after his father Solomon had died. 1 Kings 11:43 tells us this. It says, "And Solomon slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead." Then in chapter 12, verse 3, and I'll paraphrase some of this as well because I don't have time to read it word for word. In verse 3, there in chapter 12, verse 3, it tells us Jeroboam and all the people came to speak to Rehoboam. And they said, "Look, your father made our yoke grievous, but if you will make it lighter, then we will serve you." He said, "Come back in 3 days and I'll give you an answer." Then he consulted with the elders and asked them for advice on how to answer the people. They told him in verse 7, "If you will be a servant unto these people and will serve them, then they will be your servants also forever." But he forsook the elders. He forsook their counsel. And he listened to the counsel of the young men who he had grown up with. And they advised him to tell the people that his little finger would be thicker than his father's loins, and he would add to their heavy yoke. "Whereas my father chastised you with whips," he said, "I will chastise you with scorpions." And, that's what he told the people. It was his intention to lay heavier taxes on them than Solomon did. So the 10 northern kingdoms rebelled against Rehoboam and set up their own kingdom in what would later become Samaria. and they came to be known as the house of Israel. And those in Jerusalem under the rule of Rehoboam became known as the house of Judah, or the kingdom or government of Judah. So you had the house of Judah in the south at Jerusalem, and the house of Israel in the north, of which would later be known as Samaria. The house of Israel continued to exist for roughly another 240 years after this, and they were continually set in their wicked ways. There was never a time in which they really wholeheartedly turned back to God. And after God had sent Elisha, and several other prophets, he had finally had enough. And the king of Assyria came and took them into captivity. Now this happened roughly 100 years before Ezekiel was born. Then comes along Ezekiel with prophecy for the kingdom of Israel about what's going to happen to them. Well, hey, something had already happened. And the commentaries, you look through them and they just seem to shrug this off. That they seem to shrug off that what Ezekiel prophesied or said was said to what we commonly refer to as the house of Judah. After all, the Jews are Israelites. And they were the only visible part of Israel that was left. Now, some people in commentaries say that the expression house of Israel and house of Judah are only synonyms and can be used interchangeably throughout the Bible. Synonyms, of course, are different words which mean the same thing. An example of this would be a bottle and a flask. They're the same thing. But is this true when we refer to the house of Israel and the house of Judah, as some suggest? Well, let's start here in chapter 4, verse 1. It says, "Now, son of man, take a towel." This may have been a block of clay or something. But he says, take a towel and put it in front of you and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. What he's doing here, he's making this little model of the city of Jerusalem on a piece of clay or a tile. Verse 2, God said, "And lay siege against it, and build a fort against it. Build a ramp up to it, set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it." God tells him to make this little model city of Jerusalem with all these armaments around it. Then in verse 3 he says, "Moreover, take you an iron pan." My reference in my Bible here says a flat pan or a slice of iron, "and set it for a wall of iron between you and the city, and set your face against it," which means to oppose it or be in opposition against it. "And it shall be besieged, and you shall lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel." So we can see up to this point why some people might say, since Jerusalem at this time was inhabited by Jews who were a part of Israel, that it was Jerusalem he was talking about. But it was certainly not the house of Israel in the sense the house or the divided kingdom. So let's read on here in verse 4. "Then lie on your left side and put the sin of the people of Israel upon you. You are to bear their sins for the number of days you lie on your side. I have assigned you the number of the days as the years of their sins. So for 390 days you will bear the sins of the people of Israel. After you have finished this, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sins of the people of Judah. I have assigned you 40 days, a day for each year. So I asked you, are we dealing with synonyms here for the same people? No, we are dealing with two sets of people in which their punishments are different. For the length of their sins was different. God tells Ezekiel, the different times you lie here is for the years of their punishment for sins. He says, you shall lay 390 days, which would be 390 years for the sins of the house of Israel, or the northern kingdom, which is more than the time they existed as a kingdom. So, and 40 years for the house of Judah. So what does this mean? Well, this is one of the things I profess I really don't understand completely, although I do have my opinions. However, I'm going to throw some things out to you in a few moments, especially for all the biblical history buffs and the chart readers out there. For it appears no one seems to fully understand and agree on this symbolism as of yet. And I suspect I will probably get some response from this. Point being is we have two different groups of people having different periods of time of their sins and different punishments imposed upon them. So Ezekiel lies on one side facing north for the children of Israel, and then on the other side facing south for the children of Judah. Ezekiel does not use these terms interchangeably as with synonyms. Now, that being said, there can be some doubtfulness or uncertainty when he uses the house of Israel as a term. As an example, we could refer to Mr. and Mrs. Trent, and Grace, and Sherry, and Jamie, and myself. Can't include you and you. But we're Tennesseans. But we're also Americans. But we cannot say that all Americans are Tennesseans. Because Gail and Alma, they're not Tennesseans. They live somewhere else, but they are Americans, But there can be no doubt as to his reference to the house of Judah. And you cannot use the words Americans and Tennesseans as synonyms that can be interchangeable. It's the same way with Judah. All Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews. So there is a distinction to be made between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. However, as you read through the book of Ezekiel, the house of Israel, in certain places, I will have to agree, can be inclusive also of the house of Judah. But as you read through this, there can be no doubt to his reference to the house of Judah, which is collectively made up by the tribes of Judah, Levi, and Benjamin. We need to remember also that Ezekiel saw what he saw and heard was in a vision. And what he saw and heard was for the future. It was not for those people around him at that time. And what he prophesied for the house of Judah is just as much for the future as what he prophesied for the house of Israel. For they will both exist in the end time. For the people he was sitting amongst, they had already experienced captivity. And what what he's talking about is a future captivity for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So 390 days and 40 days, using the day for a year principle, adds up to be 430 years. So what does these 430 years represent? Well, I only looked up a couple of references on this. One was Bullinger's Companion Bible, and I forget the other source, which I looked up. I don't remember what it was. However, there are all kinds of resources and opinions on this, should you care to look them up. And what I looked up, in Bullinger's, they had this chronological charts from the time of Adam all the way up to the captivity of the house of Israel. And what these charts showed was not what most people assume it says in Exodus 12. So let's go to Exodus 12 and start in verse 40. Exodus 12, verse 40. It says, "Now the sojourning of the house of Israel, or the children of Israel, who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years." And that's what these 390 days and 40 days add up to. And this is a verse which has an apparent contradiction for a lot of people. For in the book of Galatians, there is a reference to Abraham and a reference to the Exodus and the giving of the law. That's in Galatians 3:16. The first part of Galatians 3:16 there. It says, "Now Abraham and his seed, to Abraham and his seed were the promises made." And then verse 17, Apostle Paul says, "And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before God in Christ, the law which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect." What he's saying is the law which was introduced 430 years later on Mount Sinai does not set aside or take the place of the promise God made to Abraham. So this 430 years would have to begin at the sojourning of Abraham to the time of the Israelites leaving Egypt and the law given at Mount Sinai. So therefore, according to the references I looked up, this means the Israelites were only in the land of Egypt for about 250 to 230 years, not the complete 430 years as some people assume. This is also confirmed in the book by Josephus, who wrote a history of the Jewish people. This is what he says, speaking of the Israelites leaving Egypt, page 62 in the book of Josephus. "They left Egypt in the month of Exanthus, I guess is how that's pronounced, on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob moved into Egypt." And as you look at these chronological charts, it shows that that's the way they came up with that. That's the way it is. So let's read Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 again. It says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel, who dwelt at that time in Egypt," it doesn't say at that time, but it says who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. So it really doesn't say they were in Egypt 430 years. It says their sojourning as a people were 430 years. Now, as all you people begin your study on this, there's something else you might want to consider. Ezekiel lay on his left side 390 days and on his right side 40 days. And we know the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So that it may be that that it was 390 days from the time Abraham began his sojourning to the time the children of Israel left Egypt and then wandered 40 years in the wilderness. It may be that the 40 years are included in this sojourning. Now, I'm not saying that's the way it was, people, because I wasn't there to see it through. But it does make sense in light of Scripture and some historical references, especially by what Apostle Paul said and the chronological occurrence of time. So there, I've thrown it to you. Take it and run with it. And dive into your studies. And I would like to hear some of your comments on the subject. Just don't get nasty about it. And it could be, although the pattern is there, that this number doesn't really relate to any historical event, but are there only to relate to an idea or concept to the reader. So those of you who want to try to run all this down, good luck. For I think things will become more transparent as prophecy transpires. For prophecy is not only a prediction of the future, but is more so to give meaning to the future, so that when certain events come to pass, we will know what's going on. Ezekiel makes this very plain. So after God had told Ezekiel these things, he goes on to say in verse 7, that's verse 4 and verse 7, I think I'm right. Verse 4. Well, I'm not. Verse 7 here. Make sure I'm right. Yeah. Chapter 4, verse 7 there in Ezekiel. He says, "Therefore you shall set your face towards the siege of Jerusalem, and your arm shall be uncovered, and you shall prophesy against it." God's having Ezekiel play out all these little things. He says, "And behold, I will lay bands upon you, or ropes, tie you up, and you shall not turn from one side to the other, until you have ended the days of your siege." And as we read along here, it's difficult to know, whether this is in real time or he's in vision. For most commentators will argue he did not lay on his side 24 hours a day, for 390 days, which would have been 13 months for the house of Israel and 1 month and 10 days for Judah. They say that he lay on his side only for part of each day. For they say he would have had to gotten up and cooked his food, and the Lord told him to prepare, and of course he would have had to relieve himself. But again, that is neither here nor there as it pertains to the prophecy. Continuing on in verse 9, he says, "Take also unto you wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and fitchets, and put them in one vessel. And make you bread from them, according to the number of days you shall lie upon your side. 390 days shall you eat thereof. And your food which you shall eat shall be by weight. 20 shekels a day, from time to time shall you eat it. You shall drink also water by measure. The 6th part of a hin, from time to time shall you drink it. And you shall eat it as you would barley cakes. And you shall bake it with the dung that comes out of man in their sight. And the Lord said, Even so shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles." So he's making a point here by going through this thing that he's telling Ezekiel to do. He says, "And the Lord said, Even so shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, where I will, future tense, he says, drive them." So here we see Ezekiel speaking again of the house of Israel, or the children of Israel, which could also be inclusive of Judah as well. But these people, the people of Judah he was among, were already in captivity. They had already been driven from their home. And the house of Israel, or the northern 10 tribes, had already been driven into the nations of the Gentiles at least 130 years before Judah was taken into captivity. So his prophecy could not be for those people he was sitting among, as some theologians claim, but it was for a future time. Verse 14 here in chapter 4. "Then Ezekiel said, Ah, Lord God, behold, my soul has not been polluted. For from my youth up, even till now, I have not eaten of that which dies of itself, or is torn in pieces, neither has came abominable flesh into my mouth. Excuse me. Now, Ezekiel was a priest. And what he was saying was he had always kept himself clean according to Levitical law. So the Lord told him he would give him cow's dung instead of man's dung. Now, we call them cow chips out on the farm. The Plains Indians back in the Old West used dried buffalo chips for fuel. It may have passed through a buffalo, but it was actually vegetable matter or highly digested straw. So it burned good, which reminds me of an old joke. Seems there was a bad winter coming on, and food was scarce. So this old Indian chief gathered his people around him and said, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is all we have to eat this winter is buffalo chips. But the good news is we've got plenty of them. But the prophecy here is that the house of Israel, and that could also be inclusive of the house of Judah, will at a future time be driven again into captivity. And because you have not cared about the clean things or made a difference between the clean and the unclean, he says, where I drive you, you will eat dirty food, and everything you have will be dirty. Because you have made no difference between the clean and the profane. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, behold, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they shall eat bread by weight. And with care they shall drink water by measure. That's why he told Ezekiel to do that, to portray what was coming. Verse 17, that they may want bread and water, and be astonished one with another, and consume away for their iniquities. Excuse me. Now, up through chapter 4, it really doesn't tell us in detail why they are going to go into captivity, only that it is for their iniquities or for their sins. God has become displeased with his people, and he's going God has become displeased with his people, and it's going to happen to the house of Israel in the future. For those of us who have studied the Bible and history know that in the end time, the house of Israel will still exist. And we firmly believe that the United States and Great Britain lost my notes here, are part of that, are part of the end time house of Israel. We firmly believe that. And the warning that he gave is that in the end time, we will be besieged and driven into captivity. Now, some people look at this and say, but that was the way back then. Things are different now. Things aren't like that today. Something like that could never happen today. We could never be besieged. We're the strongest nation on the earth. Well, as you think about that, let's read on as to what Ezekiel had to say. Chapter 5, verse 1. He says, Son of man, take you a sharp knife. Take you a barber's razor, and cause it to pass upon your head, and upon your beard. Then take balances, or scales, to weigh and divide the hair. Now, as you go back and you look at the instructions for the priesthood, you will see this is one of the things that a priest just didn't do. To shave your head in that culture was a sign of shame. And no doubt, God making this request of Ezekiel was a prediction of a shameful death for the people of Israel. God told Israel to take a set of scales and divide up the hair. When the days of your siege comes to an end, burn 1/3 of the hair inside the city. So Ezekiel was to take 1/3 part of his hair and burn it inside this little model city which he had built. And take another 1/3 and strike it with a sword all around this little model of Jerusalem. And take the other 1/3 and throw them up into the wind, for I will pursue them with drawn sword. Then he says, but take a few hairs and tuck them away in the folds of your garment. Again, take a few of these and throw them into the fire and burn them up. That reminds me of the church, you know. That some of the people in the church will also, that has gone back into the world, you know, that reminds me of that. I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's what it reminds me of. A fire will spread there to all Israel, he said. Now these hairs, folks, they represent people. It shows that 1/3 will be killed in the city or the nation through famine or whatever. And 1/3 will be killed trying to escape. And 1/3 will be taken into captivity. You know, which, you know, and it's virtually impossible to reclaim people when they're scattered out like that into captivity. Yeah, when Ezekiel tucks a few strands of hair in his clothing, it seems to picture God's plan to keep a few people safe through this time, or this period of judgment. And that he could bring back a remnant to serve him again. And there are many verses in the Bible which substantiate this, that he will bring back a remnant to again serve him in the future. If you don't jot these down, I'm not going to turn to them, but Jeremiah 23:3 and Jeremiah 30:18, Ezekiel 14:22, and there's many other places besides those. That's just some that I just came across at the spur of the moment. Thus says the Lord God, he says, this is Jerusalem. A lot of people, you know, when they read through Old Testament prophecies, when they see prophecies about Israel and Jerusalem, what comes into their mind is that one little nation over there in the Middle East today. And all this stuff that's prophesied happening right now around the nation of Israel, you know, or all this stuff that's prophesied to happen, you know, about Israel and everything, it's about that little nation which is over there today. And as a matter of fact, a lot of stuff is going to happen around that little nation today. But it's far more widespread than that. Keep in mind what we just read in chapter 4. When Ezekiel laid siege, what city was the siege laid against? Jerusalem. And what people were represented by Jerusalem in that siege? There were two groups of people represented. The house of Israel and the house of Judah. And as you read through the Old Testament prophets and what they had to say, it's easy to see that when Jerusalem is portrayed as the object of God's wrath, it is portrayed as the capital or the center of spiritual leadership of all of God's people, not just Judah. For if our understanding is right, and I believe it is, the house of Israel will, or is, a separate group of people in the end time from that little nation over there in the Middle East. A separate group of people of what is called Israel today, which is made up mostly of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. And those of us sitting in this room, and those of us who may hear this later, we are sitting now, at this time, in part of the house of Israel at the end time, by being in this nation. So a prophecy generally portrayed to be against Jerusalem should be taken seriously by anyone who is an Israelite or is represented by Israel in prophecy, which would include us. Verse 5. Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set it in the midst of the nations and countries that are around about her. And she has changed my judgments into wickedness more than the nations, and my statutes more than the countries that are round about her. For they have refused my judgments and my statutes. They have not walked in them. Excuse me. God's not saying that they have broken my laws only. He says they changed my laws. This is one of the contentions Jesus had with the Pharisees when he was on this earth. They had taken God's law and twisted it around to suit their own purposes. The main reason for doing so is so they could steal and take advantage of other people. Goes on in Washington all the time. Our laws have been twisted around so much they don't even resemble or represent the Founding Fathers' original intent. Why? Mostly to benefit the politicians and the wealthy. And take a look at what King Jeroboam did back at that time in the northern kingdom, which was called the House of Israel, before they were taken into captivity by the Assyrians. For what he did was one of the main reasons they went into captivity. Of course, the people weren't guiltless either, for they went right along with him. The story is in 1 Kings 12, verses 25 through 23. And I'll paraphrase this. I'm not going to read it. But after the northern 10 tribes broke away from Jerusalem and the rule of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, who was over the northern 10 tribes, was afraid if the people went back to Jerusalem to sacrifice, their hearts would again turn to Rehoboam and he would be killed. So what did he do? He made 2 calves of gold, it tells us, and said to the people, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. It also tells us he made priests of the lowliest of people, who were not of the sons of Levi, as God had ordained. It also tells us, instead of keeping the Feast of Tabernacle on the 15th day of the 7th month, he proclaimed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month. A feast, which was a feast he had devised in his own heart. And although he was not a priest himself, it tells us he offered burnt offerings upon the altar before the 2 golden calves. What he and the people did were abominations before God. So God finally had enough, and he sent them into captivity. And folks, what Ezekiel prophesied, it's going to happen again to the modern day Israelites for the same reasons. Abominations before God. When you twist God's law and make a perversion out of his laws and make things which God says are abominations legal and acceptable in the land, namely homosexual and sacrificing of our little children to the god of convenience, what else can we expect? What else could we expect? We have a homosexual running for the nomination, hoping to get elected as President of the United States. That's how far we've come. And since he's supposed to be the woman half in the relationship, if he gets elected as president, it will be the first time in history of this nation that instead of a first lady in the White House, we will have a first man. And the funny thing is, the ancient Israelites, as well as the modern day Israelites, have always had this pagan approach to everything. They don't necessarily deny God. It's just that they want to take a pagan approach to worshiping God. I don't have to read it to you because we all know the story. How in Exodus 32, when Moses went up into the mountain to receive the tablets of stone on which were written the Ten Commandments, it tells us when Moses delayed to come down from out of the mountain, the people gathered together before Aaron and said, "Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. Because we don't know what has happened to this man Moses that brought us out of the land of Egypt." Well, it wasn't Moses. It was God that brought them out of the land of Egypt under the guidance of Moses. So Aaron, we know the story. He took their gold and he made a golden calf. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." They had this pagan idol here and they worshiped before it, yet they wanted to attach God's name to it. And it was supposed to make everything all right. What do we do today? Well, we observe Easter and Christmas, which are ancient pagan customs, but we want to infuse God into it. And if we can do that, then it's okay. No different today than it was back then. They and we, as a nation, want to take two different religions and fuse them into one. God says that don't work. That will not work. Trying to change the laws of God, twisting them around to suit ourselves, is an abomination and a sin. And it will bring punishment from the Almighty. That is Ezekiel's message, people. Here are people who had God's law. And in the end, they were worse in obedience to those laws than the people that were around them, to whom the law was not given. How in the world can that happen? Nature itself suggests to all men that certain things are wrong. Nature itself does. And even the Gentiles honor those things because they learned it from nature, not because gave it to them, but not Israel, to whom the law was specifically given. Most people know from nature, or what nature has imposed on them, that it's wrong to kill their brother. But Israel did not see the laws of God as written into the nature of things. They saw them as a religious system imposed on them by God. They saw them as something subject to individual judgment or preference. Well, all through the prophecy, these prophecies which God gave by Ezekiel, he keeps calling the house of Israel and the house of Judah collectively together a rebellious house. And in verse 9 here, in verse 4, he says, "I will do in you that which I have not done before, and whereunto I will not do any more the like, because of all your abominations." God says, I am one to do something to you, or I'm going to do something to you which I have never done to anyone before and will never do again. And it's because of your sins and your abominations. He says, you have defiled my sanctuary with your detestable things and with all your abominations. Therefore I will diminish you, or I will leave you. Neither shall my eye spare you, neither will I have pity. Then he repeats again what he prophesied to Ezekiel. A third part of you shall die with the pestilence and with famine, and they shall be consumed in the midst of you, or in the city. And the third part shall fall by the sword around you, those that are trying to flee. And I will scatter a third part into the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. Thus shall my anger be accomplished, and I will cause my fury to rest upon them. And I will be comforted, and they shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it in my zeal, when I have accomplished my fury in them. This, folks, is, was not prophesied for the people whom Ezekiel was among at the time. The house of Judah were already in captivity, and the house of Israel, or the northern 10 tribes, had already gone into captivity about 100 or 130 years earlier. What I've gone over today, and many other prophecies in the book of Ezekiel, are for us people, us in the end time, today. So let us watch and pray and live our lives the best we can according to God's instructions. For it is those few which will be bound in His skirts which will be protected.